Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Todd Tiemann. I'm a principal analyst with Enterprise Strategy Group. And what I want to talk about today is get into the enterprise browser. It's now the centerpiece of how most of us and most knowledge workers do work in the enterprise. In the morning, you get to your desk, you log in, you fire up your machine, be it a mobile device, be it a laptop, and you get into the enterprise browser. You get into the browser. It's changed the way we operate. And it's also changing the enterprise attack surface. The browser now is that new endpoint. And it's sort of an underappreciated part of the attack surface that I wanted to dive into, that we're going to dive into. And it's also an emerging blind spot in most folks' defenses. Now, I'm the analyst at Omdia, which is formerly Enterprise Strategy Group, looking at identity security as well as data security. And I'm here with Mark Orlando, who's the field CTO with Push Security. And we're going to have what looks to be a stimulating conversation around that enterprise browser and that expanding attack surface, how the threats are also evolving, and how you can help get visibility to and counter those threats. So before we get into it, Mark, could you introduce yourself for those that aren't familiar with who you are and some of your background, how you came to be here?
Yeah, pleasure to be here with you, Todd. Mark Orlando, Field CTO at Push Security. So my role at Push as Field CTO is to act as a technical advisor and in some cases a strategic advisor to our customers and partners and prospects. So I work very closely with not only our sales and marketing teams, but also our research team, as well as our product team, to make sure we're aligned and providing the most value that we can. My background is in primarily detection and response, working in security teams, building and leading security teams. I've been in the field for going on 24 years now. I'm also on faculty at the SANS Institute, where I teach courses on building and leading security teams and doing security analysis and investigations. So that's my background. And when I talk about advising customers and partners and prospects, usually it's somewhere in that detection and response or security operations realm.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. And it's a topic, just speaking personally, is near and dear to my heart. I actually spent like 3.5 years in managed detection and response in various capacities. And it's a fascinating space with a sort of evolving attack surface that you have to keep up with. But what I'm doing now is I'm an industry analyst with Omdia. And for those of you not familiar with it, we're known for rigorous market research, where we're surveying, understanding what some of those key pain points might be, what the threats that are emerging are. And while you who are watching this, you might have your kitchen cabinet, if folks you talk to and think, well, I got my finger on the pulse of what's happening. What I'm doing as an industry analyst is going out to hundreds of folks to understand what the market writ large is doing. And what I want to share with you is some research that we recently published. Beautiful. I think that appears. Now, this got published just a couple months ago. And what I was doing was diving into what some of the key pain points are around identity security, and also just getting the lay of the land. And this slide sort of provides the lay of the land, because I asked how many applications does your enterprise use on the whole? And the about 50% of the respondents had from 1,000 to 10,000 employees, and the rest skewed higher than that. But the mean came back to be 1,100 apps. And those are apps that the identity security team has visibility to. Probably most of those are sanctioned apps. So what this doesn't touch on is unsanctioned apps, as well as apps that might not be part of the enterprise portfolio, where knowledge workers are going out to business partners, or they're going to read the media. They're going out to the New York Times website, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What what struck me was how large that attack surface is, because those apps, the bulk of those apps are web-based apps. And for your particular enterprise, it might be smaller, might be larger. I was at a conference like a month ago where one of the identity teams stood up and said, well, it was a top 10 financial institution. And the gentleman said, we have 13,000 apps that we need to manage. So, it can go higher than this. What I wanted to get at is, Mark, what are the key trends that you're seeing in terms of why that browser point is such a focal point for productivity and risk? Because you can see here, it is widely used. There's a lot of apps that everybody's having to access, and is what the data says.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and I think, the story is right there. And I think you said it yourself, Todd. We're seeing this, huge kind of SaaS ecosystem or SaaS sprawl, however you want to describe it. And I think it's also important to kind of point out some of the nuance here, which is that, even at these numbers, or even on the larger end with that, financial sector organization that you referenced, we're talking primarily there about managed apps, right? And I believe you said sanctioned apps, which is the key word. So these are apps that, for all intents and purposes, are part of corporate IT, even though those apps may be owned by a third party. And sanctioned sort of implies that the IT team is kind of managing at least the accounts or identities and access to those apps. They're under some sort of governance or control, or at the very least, we know that they're there, and we know that users are using those apps, potentially sharing information or sharing some level of access with those apps. And I think that's certainly an important and very large attack surface. But I think beyond that, we've also got those unsanctioned apps, or actually, I think there are two additional buckets. And the first would be apps which IT may not manage or may not have direct access to observe, but we know that various user groups are either self-provisioning or they're utilizing SaaS in some way. So think about the marketing team that's using some sort of contact management or CRM kind of app. And perhaps the IT team doesn't really manage access to that app. They've allowed the marketing team to kind of self-manage that because that's something exclusive to their group. So that's kind of the second category, which is, let's say, implicitly sanctioned, but not actively managed. And
it's your finance group going out to the local tax authority to pay taxes. They set up an account there.
Exactly. They've got to do it. We know they do. We're going to slow them down by trying to manage it. So we're just going to let them self-manage. So, right, that's the second category. And then the third, and I think, perhaps scariest category would be those apps that users are just signing up for themselves, granting access to, using their corporate identity, where we don't even know that that's happening, right? And for various reasons, those kinds of apps can be kind of hidden from network monitoring tools, hidden from endpoint kind of management or endpoint security tools. And so when we talk about this kind of SaaS ecosystem, we're really talking about all three of those categories, in addition to this very substantial problem that the data has proven out here, which is thousands of sanctioned apps.
Cool. But there's when you take us two steps back, there's sort of been an evolution in terms of how people have approached security over time. You and I are both a bit of a grizzled veterans. We've been around the block for a decade or two. And there was a focus for some period of time on the network, and then it sort of evolved. Could you sort of describe how you've seen the arc of evolution and how it's gotten us to where we are today, where you have the web browser as the focal point?
Sure. And I think you would agree, in cybersecurity, there's nothing really new under the sun, right? And there's this sort of cyclical thing that happens where every few years there's some kind of tectonic shifts, or maybe low and slow shift might be a better descriptor. But in terms of where kind of attackers are spending most of their time, or where their focus is, and then therefore where defenders have to kind of pivot to. And that's where you see new technology popping up, kind of new focus areas. I know when I started out as a SOC analyst back in the early 2000s, this concept of a hardened perimeter was relatively new, and we had these awesome things called intrusion detection systems where you could monitor everything that was maybe getting through the firewall or hitting the firewall. And that was, kind of the be all end all of security monitoring, more or less. And then, a few years later, it was, well, maybe now we should start paying attention to the endpoint. So you had host IDS and host IPS. And then after that, well, look at this. We've got all of this data we have to correlate and monitor. So let's put it all into a central platform, right? Which was the SIM, then EDR, and then, applications kind of became the new focus area. So over time, I think our scope and our focus has expanded to cover all of these, different kind of contested areas. And it's a natural sort of arms race where when we get relatively proficient at hardening some of this infrastructure, or at least monitoring for threats there, attackers they're going to take the path of least resistance. So they're going to go pivot to some place that maybe isn't particularly as well defended or monitored. So I think now that we're talking about browsers, which have also evolved over time. Originally we were talking about just a tool that we use to view web pages, and now effectively they're platforms running software on demand. This is where we do our authentication, right? So much happens there, and I think we're still kind of in the early stages of that most recent pivot, where I think attackers have realized that this is less well defended or less well instrumented than other parts of the environment, like network, like email, like the endpoint. And so naturally, that's where they've shifted focus. And I think, cybersecurity, such as it is, as an industry or a field, is still on the front end of kind of pivoting and trying to keep up and make gains in that area to compensate for this shift in tactics.
So I get what you're describing, and you sort of had a defender lens on when you described that arc, that evolution. But why is it that the web browser is becoming so attractive to attackers? Could you double click and elaborate on why that is such an appealing point for an adversary to go after?
Sure. So, I mean, I think there are a few reasons. One is the presence of kind of identity and session data. So because we are authenticating via the browser, that's where a few kind of crucial events happen where identity is concerned, right? We're submitting credentials, in that kind of exchange, we're receiving kind of a session token, and these are very high valued assets that if an attacker can get those, right, that's very valuable, and that they can go back and access systems and data and appear as a legitimate authorized user in doing that. And that's, I think, what we are seeing with all of these identity-based attacks. We're seeing, depending on the statistic that you want to focus on, anywhere from 40, 50% to 70+% major breaches in the last couple of years have had an identity compromise or identity attack component to them. And so, kind of getting to your question, the browser becomes kind of that path of least resistance, where if I can interact with the user or elicit some sort of interaction, like getting them to log into a website that I control that maybe appears to be a legitimate login, identity provider kind of web page, or if I can get them to click on the screen and perhaps launch some sort of click fix style attack, there's a lot to be gained there, right? And again, I think we're still playing catch up, or a lot of enterprises are playing catch up in terms of how that communication is monitored, what kind of security is present there in the browser, which I think what we're seeing is the answer is not very much. And so I think that's why it's become such a popular kind of target.
And a couple points here for those that are on this. Thank you so much. I'm seeing the questions start to flow in, and I'm going to start pinging Mark with those questions. I'm not neglecting you. I want to make sure we have a good baseline here of understanding for everybody on the session before I start diving into some of those questions. But please do keep those questions coming. Now, I wanted to pivot here and actually dive into something you mentioned about, okay, you have your traditional network tools, you have your traditional endpoint tools. Why have those tools struggled to adapt to the types of identity and session-based threats that are now emerging for browsers? Why is the existing toolkit on everybody's tool belt insufficient for those sorts of threats?
Yeah, well, I mean, we'll start with EDR, which of course, these are very powerful tools, very useful, and I would never kind of advocate for moving away from EDR. But I think where EDR works the best is for threats where files are being written to disk, or someone is trying to manipulate or inject processes or make changes to the registry, or other kind of changes that impact the endpoint. And where the browser is concerned, for various reasons, some of which are kind of security, privacy, functionality, what happens inside of the browser is hidden from that kind of EDR telemetry, right? So I think if I am logging in or interacting with a web page, the EDR might see that I have started my browser, right? That the browser is running. It's going to see that I'm logged into the machine. If I've got some network telemetry that's being produced by EDR or a network security monitoring tool, it might see that I've visited, a website, visited a domain, maybe even, being kind of redirected somewhere else. But what I'm doing when I'm logging in to a web page, or I'm using, social media app, or I'm chatting with someone, on LinkedIn, for example, your EDR is not going to be able to see inside the browser what's happening there. And to a great extent, any network security monitoring tool or web proxy, they're not going to have that level of visibility either. It's going to be strictly kind of where I'm going, who I'm talking to, not necessarily what I'm sharing or what's being said.
Cool. And I'm going to pivot. There was a question that came up that I want to address. The question was coming from an MDR background, and because I've worked in MDR, and Mark, you have a lot of exposure to that. Are those offering MDR services missing the boat in solely focusing on EDR and SIM as a source of telemetry? A couple things there in my perspective, and then Mark, you can add your perspective or subtract from my perspective, whatever you want to do there. You typically aggregate your telemetry into the SIM, and then you're running detections against it, or you might be running detections in the EDR. But to what Mark just mentioned, there's a gap there. If you don't have good telemetry coming out of the web browser, you're sort of blind to those threats. So are MDR providers missing the boat? There's probably a chunk of the attack surface they don't have adequate visibility to if you're just focused on EDR, network, other sources of telemetry, would be my perspective. I think that being said, you do see some of the managed detection response players starting to understanding that, okay, I need to look at this identity threat detection response stuff. I need to provide services around that, because that's a significant part of my attack surface. Most attacks start with identity in some way, shape, or form. I think the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report said it's like 60 to 7% of attacks have some element of identity, compromised credentials involved in them. But Mark, any perspective on, from an MDR perspective, are they missing the boat when it comes to focusing on SIM and EDR?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And like you told me that, of course, I've spent several years in managed services and MDR, and I think the short answer is yes. But I think the larger answer is not entirely their fault necessarily. I think instead of getting into, they're focused on EDR and NDR, XDR, and they're missing this one additional piece, right? That's kind of an easy thing to say. But I think the larger issue there is kind of by definition, an MDR or MSSP, they're more or less looking through, a keyhole into your environment and trying to figure out, what's going on based on this relatively limited stream of data. And so I think most managed service providers are kind of behind the power curve right out of the gate, where they're not going to have the same level of visibility or awareness that an internal security team might. So, I think that's a challenge right there. And I think certainly if you add in all of this attack surface, which is browser and the SaaS ecosystem and, corporate identities, when you add that onto it as kind of blind spots, yeah, I think an MDR or a service provider is going to struggle. And in fact, they are struggling to identify and respond to these kinds of threats that we're talking about. I think that the other kind of part of this is, I have heard and seen some messaging around MDRs that are doing identity threat detection and response, or ITDR. And you might have heard some of that. I'm sure in some of your
Yep.
work, Todd, you've come
Yep.
across that, which more or less is ship us your IDP logs and we'll monitor and hunt in those IDP logs as well. And that sounds great, and I'm sure that provides some level of assurance. But the problem there is, if I've got compromised identities, compromised credentials, right? Having a record that an authorized account accessed a system is not going to be particularly helpful to me as an analyst. That looks like normal behavior, right? So a lot of these really damaging attacks that we've seen over the last year, 2 years, have started with someone either purchasing valid credentials or leveraging info stealers to gain kind of valid credentials or session IDs or session tokens, and then reusing those things. So I think one of the kind of challenges that I think service providers are having, including MDRs, is even when they say they're covering the identity component, simply checking the box on those IDP logs doesn't really solve the problem that we're talking about.
Nope, makes sense. Makes sense. Now, changing gears slightly, when I think about enterprises and browsers, my mind immediately goes to the enterprise browser category of solutions, and that's folks like Island, Seraphic. And I imagine some folks that are watching this are saying, "No, I'm covered in that space since I'm using an enterprise browser." Don't enterprise browsers solve for those browser threats?
I would say yes, in a lot of cases, enterprise browsers solve for browser threats, in that they can help protect against attacks on the browser. I think the other kind of class of threats that enterprise browsers are well suited to defend against would be like your DLP type use cases, controlling kind of what users can access, what they can upload, send, share via the browser, those data loss prevention or insider threat type use cases. And I think, they can be very effective in doing that. I think what we're more focused on are more protecting the users from threats like phishing and click fix style malware delivery and attacks kind of that target them versus protecting the organization from what the user might be doing. And so aside from just being, I think, an important kind of use case nuance there, I would compare what we do to what an enterprise browser does as, they might be like the bouncer at the door of the club, right? But they're not particularly concerned from that vantage point with what's happening inside of the club necessarily, right? So we are the security inside, making sure that everyone in there is safe and kept secure. And so there are a lot of instances where we're deployed. Of course, we deploy as a browser extension, so we can deploy inside of enterprise browsers like Island and work very well alongside them. But I think, again, our focus is more on that threat detection and response set of use cases and being as low friction and low overhead as we can be versus, an enterprise browser where you have to standardize on a single browser. There's going to be some overhead involved in creating and managing those DLP type enforcement mechanisms. So just kind of different set of use cases there. I think different set of problems and a very different deployment model.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. Now, from what I've seen, Push is doing well in the market. You're getting traction out there. You have a fair number of deployments and experience under your belt and feedback from customers. What does browser detection and response look like in practice? This is a relatively new space, and I'm wondering practically what's that mean for folks, and what are some of the aha moments that you've seen from enterprises?
Sure. So, I mean, as a blue teamer at heart, I would say the best detection that I can receive is one that's already been resolved, right?
Yeah.
So I think our kind of design philosophy has always been, if we are in fact in the browser, which we are, and we can observe everything that's happening and therefore identify some of these threats like phishing or the presence of like a phish kit or some of the malicious infrastructure behind it or a click fix style attack, if we can identify those things very, very reliably, then let's intervene, right? So we've got, I think, some extremely powerful preventative controls built into the product where if I've got a user that's attempting to type in their legitimate IDP credentials into a site that is not their IDP, it's not Google, it's not Microsoft, we are going to block that. We're not going to let you do that. We won't even let you submit, that post or those credentials, right?
Mhm.
So I think that's the first thing, and certainly kind of one of our core use cases, which is we'll throw a detection, we'll create an event there, but we're going to block, that really damaging inflection point within that attack chain. I think the second most useful detection would be one that, again, is very, very high fidelity. So we spend a lot of time thinking about how we can generate high quality, high fidelity detections, not create a lot of additional work for analysts to go figure out what happened and go chase those things down. And so the way we do that, first of all, is by being research led. So we have an applied research team. I mentioned that, at the start, that does nothing but, research into what these threats look like and how they're changing and evolving, what they look like in the wild. And the purpose of that is to take that intelligence and build it directly into the tool by way of detections and to refine those detections, right, based on what we're actually seeing. And so, creating high quality, high fidelity detections is kind of the second kind of approach there. And then the third and last thing I'll mention on this front is, again, we don't like to create additional busy work for analysts, right? And which is something that kind of speaks to me
Yep.
personally. We like to sell solutions and not work. So if, for example, we're going to alert on a credential or a password that's been compromised and is out there for sale on the dark web, which is one of the things we do, right? We're not just giving you that information and saying, hey, this account appears to be compromised. You might want to go figure it out. It might have been compromised 2 years ago. It might be someone who doesn't even work there anymore, but good luck. Instead, we're saying, this is a compromised password. It's a compromised credential that someone is actively using today in your environment, which is just one example of, hey, this is a really high fidelity, very actionable kind of alert. And I think the feedback that we've gotten from our customers is, hey, we actually prioritize push alerts, above other classes of alerts just because it is so high fidelity. And we know that when we get a detection, it's most likely something that we need to look at or respond to. So that's kind of our approach there.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And let's dig deeper into some of those threat techniques and threat detection techniques. I've read about phishing and MFA bypass that are evading traditional endpoint security products. There's a strong element of identity security that comes into play there. Could you describe some of the browser-based attacks that the push team is seeing, and as well as how common are those attacks that evade those traditional endpoint security tools?
Yeah, I'll answer the question in reverse and say increasingly very common. And I think the driver behind that is that the barrier to entry, the technical barrier to entry to launch these kinds of attacks and to automate them, to deliver them at scale, that barrier is getting lower and lower every day. And what we see quite a lot of are, these kind of phishing as a service and phish kits, where you can think of it as kind of a sophisticated attack easy button. So if you want to launch a very sophisticated phishing attack that has a very realistic looking lure, very realistic looking login page, for example, has all kinds of advanced features around detecting if you are a security tool trying to check, these anti-bot kind of features, using things like Cloudflare Turnstile, some really sophisticated methods of circumventing your security tools that may be doing some of those automated checks, right? A lot of those features are built into these toolkits, right? Like Evil Jinx and many other kinds of toolkits that are out there. And so I think, those are certainly becoming very common things that I think 10, 15, 20 years ago, certainly we would have seen as being really sophisticated techniques that you're only going to see from maybe like state-sponsored adversaries. Now, these are capabilities that are, bought and sold kind of on the, on the cyber criminal market.
Commoditized.
Yeah, heavily monetized, and just like we saw with ransomware operators, the sort of economy and the support structure and the business models that have popped up around these things are very sophisticated, and in a lot of cases mirror what you would see in like legitimate businesses. So we're certainly seeing a lot of that. I think some of the click fix techniques that we're seeing where, users are kind of tricked into clicking on what looks like a CAPTCHA, and tricked into opening up a Windows like run dialog and pasting in a command, right? Where you've got things that are not writing any files to disk, right? Not doing anything that's going to trigger an EDR, but effectively is going to do kind of the same thing that is either going to deliver like info stealer malware or is going to result in some other kind of compromise. We're seeing a lot of those, and they're getting very, very sophisticated. I think we put out some research from our team on some of what we've seen in the wild, and again, getting very, very sophisticated in terms of how realistic they see. And I think we're sort of getting further and further away with those things from what you've learned in your user training and awareness, like looking for weird looking links, or looking for the absence of that lock symbol, or poorly worded messages or poorly constructed pages. I mean, a lot of those things are kind of, they're still out there, but what we're seeing far more are these more sophisticated kind of ready-made kits that they pass a lot of those checks, quite frankly.
Okay, makes sense. Let me hit you with a question that came up in the chat here, and please, for everybody listening in, please do send your questions our way. The question is, as a possible customer, I have seen a push telemetry option to the SIM, which they have, but we also have an MSSP, a managed security service provider. Do you work with MSSPs to help them create or use run books so you can see this activity? Make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So I love this question because, again, career blue teamer, I'm a big fan of, if you've got a really reliable, high quality telemetry source, yeah, get it into your SIM, build some run books and some playbooks around it, incorporate it into your processes. And I spend a lot of time working on these kinds of run books, trying to operationalize this data. And so, as far as working with an MSSP, as you mentioned, Push, we do webhooks, we have an API. So, multiple different ways to get the data out of the platform and into a SIM, whether it's your SIM or, one that's kind of managed by an MSSP. We want customers to be able to use this data, or, their partners or providers to be able to use the data as well. So we try to be flexible in that area.
Cool. So let me share with you one additional data point here, if things cooperate. So there's that one we already saw. There we go. I hope that's showing up on the screen. I think it is. So one huge challenge for identity security teams and SOC teams is the time required for investigations. We ran this research middle of the year. It was like 370 identity leaders. And we asked about, okay, how long does it take to investigate and remediate a single critical identity related security alert? And the answer came back, and you see it on the screen, 11 person hours to investigate and remediate. For me, that was astounding, because every hour, every minute, that is the potential for an expanding blast radius if it's a true positive alert. There's going to be false positives, but if it's true positive, bad news. And those investigations can be super difficult. You're gathering context, you're pivoting between consoles, perhaps. Can you walk us through browser telemetry, how browser telemetry can accelerate that investigation and remediation process?
Certainly. I think one of the biggest differences is, we can go from inferring to knowing. So most of the incidents that I've personally investigated, previously being in a incident response team or a SOC team, if you're talking about a potentially compromised identity, it is extremely difficult to discern a valid kind of login or a valid user session from one that is an attacker who's simply kind of replaying a session or reusing credentials that have been compromised, right? So and a lot of times, quite honestly, how these investigations go is you try to look at all the evidence you have, but often the best and fastest way of resolving these investigations is just to go to the user and say, hey, did you log into this site, or did you, do these things, or are you kind of logging in from this unusual location, right? If you even have that data available. And I personally really hate that for a couple of reasons. The first is that, users, I mean, they're doing their day job, they're busy, right? And I think anytime you have to expose security to them in that way and kind of disrupt what they're doing, to me, that personally kind of feels like a fail. So, we're disrupting the user, we're burning their time because we don't have the visibility, we don't have the capability to figure out what's going on, right? I think the second issue there is that sometimes, despite them being well-meaning, those answers can be unreliable, right? I don't think I clicked on that, but I don't know. I clicked on a million things today, or you know what I mean? And so I think that's just not particularly kind of a reliable piece of evidence, is kind of feedback from the user. And so getting back to the time it takes to conduct these investigations, in many cases, again, in just my personal experience, these don't really get to satisfactory resolution. And what we end up doing, getting back to that kind of friction fail in security, is we end up having to err on the side of caution and say, we think there's a compromise here. And so just to be on the safe side, we're going to rotate their credentials, reset their passwords, kill their sessions, maybe have a service desk person go out and maybe swap out their laptop or whatever it is, right? But we're going to impact the user, and we're going to impact some kind of business process because we can't sufficiently investigate these types of alerts, because we can't see what they actually did inside the browser, and we can't get visibility into the status of their accounts or their credentials, compromised or not. Now, being in the browser, which again we deploy as an extension, so we have full visibility into the browser, right? It's kind of like a member of the security team sitting next to somebody at their desk and watching everything they're doing. So again, now we don't have to just infer and make guesses and probably err on the side of containment that's going to be disruptive. Instead, we've got very kind of hard evidence and specific answers that support a more thorough investigation. And kind of the last point I want to make on this topic, because I think it's an important one, when it comes to efficiency, if you think about this mean of 11 person hours, thinking back, you and I have been around for a while, thinking back 10 years ago, if you had said, hey, dwell time of 11 hours, we'd be doing cartwheels. We'd say, that's fantastic. We've come so far, right? But if I then asked you, well, why don't you give an attacker, a criminal, a legitimate account in your environment, and then back away, put on a blindfold, and let them do whatever they want for 11 hours. That would be a terrifying prospect, right? Mm-hmm. So to me, 11 hours is still unacceptable. And part of the urgency here, it's not just that amount of time, but in these identity attacks. And in many of the SaaS-based attacks, like the big Snowflake breach of the last year, or like you name the major identity attack, right? This kill chain idea that an attacker will get access and then they have to do like 3, 4, 5, 6 more things in order to achieve their objectives. That doesn't really apply in a lot of these identity, SaaS oriented attacks. An attacker, gains access to legitimate credentials or a legitimate session. They get access. They've got the data, right? So these kill chains or these attack cycles are dramatically compressed from what we're used to seeing in kind of on-prem environments, where as long as you could catch it early, you still presumably had some cycles to be able to take action. But here, that's just not the case. I mean, as soon as they get access, the game more or less is up. And so I think that kind of, just to bring us back to what we do, that's why we're so focused on preventing that initial access. We don't want those credentials to get compromised. So we're going to intervene in real time versus hoping and praying that we're going to see an alert and we can respond faster than 11 hours.
It's sort of that we are in a brave new world with the SaaS stuff, huge productivity enhancer, but it also, from a security standpoint, can allow adversaries to get at crown jewels far more quickly.
Right.
Something that struck me in around the push security approach was that it provides real-time detection response in the browser, and you sort of alluded to that, and you talked about that a bit. But I wanted to ask, what are some of the most powerful detections that you've seen today, and how are those different from detections you might have seen with legacy endpoint telemetry? And how does the push team update things so you can quickly respond as adversaries are changing their attack techniques?
Yeah, well, I think, we talked about some of those really high fidelity types of detections that we generate for things like compromised credentials. We can also identify, what we would consider vulnerabilities like weak passwords or otherwise poor password hygiene. Like perhaps we have an approved app that should be MFA compliant. Everybody should be using multi-factor authentication, but maybe somebody's not. Or you think you fully rolled out MFA, which is often the case, but you're still allowing password-based authentication, these kinds of ghost logins, as we refer to them. So you can identify things like that. And again, this is not trying to infer what's happening based on some network telemetry or identity telemetry. It's watching what the user is actually doing in the browser. So again, very reliable, very high fidelity types of detections. When we identify things like phish kits, for example, phishing attacks, users accessing that kind of infrastructure. I mentioned our applied research team. The advantage of having that research arm is that we're not doing kind of the basic indicator-based detections that quite frankly a lot of endpoint tools are using, a lot of network-based tools are using, a lot of proxy-based tools are using, where it's like somebody has reported this domain as being malicious. So if anyone goes to that domain, we're going to fire an alert, right?
The IOC focus.
The IOC focus, exactly. And we know that these things are maybe useful for a very, very short period of time. And then the attackers change things up and those detections, they're very brittle in that sense. So instead, what we're doing based on the research that we've got going in the field is we're creating, a series of markers to identify, in this one example, a phish kit. It's not only maybe the structure of the URL, but it's also kind of how, what the DOM looks like, that kind of blueprint of the page. It's, the behavior of that page. It's comparing what that page looks like and how it's presented to the user to what the actual legitimate, Entra or, Google Workspace login page looks like. And so we're relying on a variety of different behavioral indicators and not just those very brittle kind of IOC based indicators. And I think that's one area where we are able to supplement what a lot of these other security tools are doing, and maybe even get ahead of some of these threats where a lot of detections and preventative controls in other tools would be kind of after the fact or sort of trailing indicators of malicious activity.
So wanted to revisit the SaaS application dynamic, and it's something that identity and security teams have struggled with is shadow SaaS applications. You have your sanctions app out there, and that's great, but the workforce, they have a job to do, and they're frequently going to use some unsanctioned app, and it might be benign, but it could pose a security threat or a compliance risk. As and one of the things that Omdia found is that 65% of users bypass those security controls to get their jobs done, which you can understand. I got a job to do, and there's friction with security. I'm going to get around it because I know what I'm doing is low risk or no risk is the perception. How does Push provide visibility into that and control over those unmanaged SaaS applications? And how can you do that without disrupting users, causing more friction?
Right. Well, I think our technology that is another one of our core use cases is providing that visibility into these are all of the apps, sanctioned or no, whether you're aware of them or not. These are all the apps that users are using. Not only that, but this is the type of app it is. This is the method that they're using to log in. Are there any potential kind of security issues there with how they're authenticating to those apps? So we do provide a ton of visibility in that area, but kind of more to the point, how you enforce that kind of becomes the issue, right? Because we have to balance productivity and security, and we don't want to be overly disruptive unless we absolutely have to be. And so one of the many things that I really love about kind of our approach and the technology is that we've taken this kind of guardrail style approach to enforcement. So we provide our users with a lot of different controls around how they can kind of shape and sort of guide people to doing the sanction thing or the right thing. And what this looks like in practice is configurable banners that we can put up to say, hey, this is an unsanctioned app, please don't use it. Or in some cases, we start talking about like AI use, right?
Mhm.
Hey, by the way, if you want to use this app, you have to go read our policy, and here's the link on, how you use AI. You have to do that, right? And you have the user acknowledge that. Or, an app, or I'm sorry, a banner that says, uh, this is unsanctioned, it's not on the approved, list, and so you can't access it, or you have to put in a request or justification, and then we'll allow access. So there's a lot of really granular controls there. And the same is true with like MFA enforcement, for example, where you can start by saying, we're going to be in kind of a detect only or monitor only type of mode, and we're slowly going to walk the users towards, implementing this or using a different app or not using unsanctioned apps. But you can do that in kind of a controlled, phased way, where, again, you're able to communicate directly with them right in the browser. You're not creating a lot of work for the security team or the IT team, but you're able to ultimately kind of move the users to where you want them to be. And so I think that ability to shape behavior and not kind of apply a blunt instrument to that enforcement, it is really one thing that kind of sets us apart, and one thing I really like about the technology.
As you were describing that, and it's very cool functionality. It struck me as it's almost SaaS security posture management. SSPM is what folks might be familiar with. Do you find, and maybe I'm wrong, you can walk me back saying, no, it's a bit different, but it sounds like it's adjacent to, or it's very similar to, do you complement existing SSPM offerings, or is it sort of greenfield? Someone doesn't have a SaaS security posture management, and you provide the functionality to give them that visibility and control over unsanctioned as well as sanctioned SaaS apps?
Yeah, I would say we very much complement that kind of SSPM technology. And this gets back to one of the questions I saw someone asked in the chat, which is, are we making a business case for kind of shifting away from legacy protection, EDR, SIM? You might lump in kind of like attack surface management or SSPM there as well, right? My answer for all of those things would be absolutely not. We're a complementary technology, especially when we get into those unsanctioned or unknown apps, those shadow apps. For a lot of like SSPM or attack surface management, again, you're either starting from what you know about and what you're able to configure in those tools, and therefore you're going to miss things that are unsanctioned or unknown. Or you're going to do things like, watch what a user signs up for and then kind of infer that maybe they're going to use that SaaS app, and therefore, it's something that you should look at. So again, just because we are unique in the sense that we're sitting in the browser, we're able to provide an additional layer of visibility control that you're not going to get from network or proxy or endpoint-based tools. And so therefore, we're highly complementary to those tools.
And at the same time, you're striving to be high fidelity, so you're not throwing off a lot of noise that people need to chase. It's giving them actionable telemetry.
Yeah, absolutely. And Todd, I know we're getting near to the end of our time, and one point that I really want to make, because I think it's very important, is I think we're getting to kind of a crisis in detection and response, where kind of over time we've started to conflate volume with value. And we think, wow, we put in this tool and it's generating all of this noise and it's doing all of this stuff, and I guess that wasn't happening before, so therefore it's providing a lot of value. And what we're seeing now is, especially as security budgets, they're not going down, but I think they're certainly starting to slow down overall. Maybe you've seen this in some of the research work that you do. It's more important than ever to make sure that the investments you're making are providing real value. They're not just creating more work for your team. And I know a lot of teams that are already, underwater. They can't possibly keep up with all of the alerts and all of the different things that, they have to do in addition to looking at alerts. So again, that's, as you said, that's a big focus for us, is high quality detections, high fidelity alerts. That's maybe not accounting for some of the other advanced capabilities that we have coming, and maybe we can talk about that next. But yeah, definitely, a focus on providing value, not just volume. That's very top of mind for us.
That's actually where I want to take things. Thank you for the segue there, is to sort of do a little prognostication, a little crystal balling. As you look into the future, as you talk to customers, see what the development that Push Security has coming, what are you seeing as some of the key themes or innovations that we should expect, or sort of shifts in the security landscape that we're going to need to adapt to?
Yeah, well, I've got two for you.
Okay.
One is I think a little more specific to what we're doing, and one I think is related to what we do, but maybe a more kind of broadly applicable to the industry, I guess, as a whole. So the first is, now that we've been working with customers for a little bit of time, some of our more advanced and I would say more kind of mature customers, technically mature customers, now that they've kind of seen the value of this telemetry that you can get out of the browser, this kind of rich telemetry and ability to identify, malicious and suspicious activities that maybe an EDR or a proxy or a network monitoring tool wouldn't see. We've definitely seen a tremendous appetite for more kind of rich data from the browser, which we can provide, that teams can use for threat hunting, for detection engineering, and to kind of define their own, detections and their own logic beyond the kind of out of the box capabilities that we provide. And so that's something that we've been working on for some time now. It's something that we're using on a limited basis internally, and will be released more broadly probably next year. But this kind of flight recorder type functionality, which is something that we're really excited about, and something that I think is really going to kind of change the game when it comes to in-browser detection and response. So that's where I think one area that we're very excited about going. But I think more broadly, a really hot topic, of course, is AI, right? And so as we talk to a lot of
Agentic
customers,
AI, baby.
agentic AI, I saw, I think it was Microsoft saying, well, our whole operating system is becoming agentic now. And so, that's obviously kind of, really, really high priority for a lot of customers and prospects. And one of the things that I'm running into is, CISOs and CTOs who are trying to just get their arms around this thing. And they're trying to figure out, how do I stop people from using these, unapproved apps, or sharing sensitive data in these prompts, or uploading sensitive, files to be trained on these, for these models to train on, which we don't want. So like privacy, governance, security, these are really hot topics in that kind of AI lane. And one of the things that I think we're going to see a lot is more of a focus on kind of the fundamentals around securing kind of how these tools are used. So, I think once some of the hype kind of normalizes a little bit, and all the great things that AI can do for us, which of course there are a lot of things, a lot of promise there. CISOs, I know, CTOs, they're already thinking about, how do I exercise some governance and some control? How do I try to lock some of this stuff down? And I think our position with that, kind of following on to what you and I just talked about with app discovery, before you can start to exercise any kind of DLP or insider threat type control, you got to know what you've got, right? And what we're seeing is there are, thousands of apps out there that are not the core AI agents. They're not Anthropic, they're not OpenAI, they're not Google, Gemini, but they're just regular productivity apps, or design apps, or security apps even, that have AI features where some of those risks are there. And so I think one area that I'm very excited about, where I think we can, provide a lot of value in this area, would be just providing visibility and control over that app ecosystem. I think that's something that is kind of a prerequisite for where a lot of organizations are going to try to get to as they try to get their arms around this kind of AI challenge.
No, absolutely. You got to have visibility before you can manage and control something, is typically the norm. Let me share one thing with everybody, because we've gone through a bunch of different materials and information and knowledge, but you might want to learn more, because we are bumping up against time here. If you want to learn more, there's a QR code on your screen. There's a wealth of information on the Push website. Mark, thank you so much for the insights you've shared, and for the time. It's been a lot of fun. It's been a really insightful conversation.
Thanks, Todd. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Now, but and before, I know we are bumping up against time here. We've covered pretty much an amazing amount of information in a short amount of time. Is there anything that comes to mind, any typical questions that you bumped up against that we have not touched? Any last thoughts that you want to share?
No, I think we pretty much covered everything. I just want to give another call out to kind of our the research that we do. I mean, our team Some of the best researchers I've seen, and I've been in the field for quite some time. And so I would definitely encourage folks who are curious about this space, about our approach, about some of the threats we're seeing, a lot of the topics that we covered here, go check out our blog. We do our best to share that research. And I think there's lots of great content, lots of original applied research there that can provide some great, deeper insights into a lot of the things we've covered today.
Having perused some of those blogs, it is super insightful, super interesting. So if you want to learn more about browser threats, browser threat dynamics, if you want to get better visibility and control over that new piece of the attack surface, or more prominent piece, I should say, of the attack surface, you can use the QR code here, or visit Push Security's website. But with that, thank you very much, everybody, and have a great day.